chronically elevated insulin is problematic for a whole variety of different reasons. Yes, for the development of type 2 diabetes, of putting on weight. Also, a lot of people aren't aware that it increases blood pressure, increases fluid retention, increases a type of cholesterol called VLDL, very low density lipoprotein, which can be problematic. And so for a variety of reasons, we want to lower that. So there's two broad ways I'm getting that we can do that. One is through a diet that does not constantly push up insulin. And the other way is with a form of intermittent fasting, or bringing in some type. So if we start off with food and diet, you mentioned low carb earlier on in this conversation. Of course, we know how divisive the diet landscape currently is. In your experience, if we're thinking about a diet, food choices that don't spike insulin too much, what are the kind of principles you like your patients to follow?
Yeah, and I think this is where, there's always a lot of difference in opinion versus low carb versus high carb. And I actually think that there's a huge difference even within carbohydrates. So the problem is not generally the carbohydrates, but the processing that makes the biggest difference. So if you look at the glycemic index, which is, which looks at carbohydrate containing foods, sees how much insulin tends to go up and glucose tends to go up. They tend to go up together, of certain foods. What you see is that unprocessed carbohydrates tend to cause a lot lower spike in insulin than processed foods. So you take cereals like Cheerios and stuff, they're really, really high. You take a very refined product like white bread, just very, very high. But then you look at something like boiled potatoes, and it's just extremely low. They're both carbohydrate-containing foods. So there's a big difference even within carbohydrates. Beans are carbohydrates. They have a different type of amylopectin. They have amylopectin C versus amylopectin A. Their digestion is completely different. They're still carbs. So trying to simplify it to just carbs is difficult because you could eat a lot of beans, and who gets fat eating beans? Like very few people.
Are you talking like black beans, kidney beans, these sort of things?
Yeah, all beans. Yeah. The type of carbohydrate they contain is amylopectin C, which is harder to digest and therefore leads to much lower blood glucose levels, much lower insulin levels. But insulin is sort of that key. So even within carbohydrates, so people think, well, one of the things is to cut carbs, which is a reasonable thing, but cutting the refined carbs does a lot better, because you have to understand that a lot of countries, a lot of cultures have had high carbohydrate intakes, and in the past have never had a big problem. So China, for example, was classic in the 80s. It was eating 300 grams a day of carbohydrates, almost all white rice. And there was almost no obesity. This is 1980. Then, of course, recently they started eating a lot more processed foods, a lot more sugary foods. Now their obesity is just exploding. But it was not just the carbs.
Why do you? This is really interesting for me. So white rice is a refined carbohydrate. Why do we have societies with high volumes of carbohydrates who are not putting on weight and who are not getting type 2 diabetes? And that example you use of China there is really interesting. 300 grams of white rice a day, you would think would spike insulin and would, cause people to get sick, but it wasn't.
Yeah, and it wasn't.
And one of the theories I put forward in my first book was this idea that maybe in the West, in the modern world in which we now live, where people are chronically stressed, they're chronically underslept, they're chronically underactive, and they're eating a lot of highly processed foods. Altogether, that's creating the perfect conditions for high levels of insulin resistance. And I thought, well, maybe the low-carb diet has a particular utility in modern stressed-out cultures. I don't know. Have you got any comments on that? And how do you explain that in the 1970s, they were eating this in China and not getting sick?
I think there's a few things. One is that the amount of sugar they were eating was just almost zero.
Yeah.
So sugar which is fructose, is metabolized quite differently than glucose. So when you metabolize glucose, all your cells in the body can use glucose. When you metabolize fructose, only the liver can use fructose. So the fructose goes straight to your liver, and there it gets converted and causes fatty liver, causes all kinds of things when you're eating too much fructose. So it can get converted back into glucose, but for a lot of reasons, it just gets turned into fat through de novo lipogenesis. You get fatty liver, you get insulin resistance, which causes hyperinsulinemia. So the fructose is actually much worse for you than the glucose, in my opinion, because if you are 150 pounds, you have 150 pounds of body that's using glucose versus sort of 5 pounds of liver that can metabolize fructose. So the fructose is much, much more obesogenic, I think, than the glucose. So therefore, the practical side is that sugar and sweet things like that are just much more fattening than starchy foods.
So maybe you're saying then in China, back then, because they're not having much fructose,
yeah, almost zero.
That therefore they can actually, the bodies can handle the 300 grams of white rice each day. Whereas on the background of a lot of fructose, which is of course how many of us live these days, too much sugar, too much fruit juice, all these kind of things, maybe with a background of that, suddenly the white rice starts to become problematic?
Yeah, I think so. I think the fructose really makes that much worse. But the other thing is that there's different reasons why. And two, they weren't eating all the time, right? They weren't eating constantly. It's not like they're eating 8 times a day of white rice. And the third thing I think that's sort of always overlooked because it doesn't fit into this neat little square is that there's different reasons why we eat. Like there's the hunger, the nutrition part of things, which we think is important. But in this day and age, it's probably the least important of the reasons that we eat. There's the habits, right? You eat because it's time to eat. That's really the only reason. And you eat because it's delicious. So if you take any diet that is monotonous, so no matter what diet it is, so you could eat, say you love pizza, but I give you pizza, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Okay. Very soon, much sooner than you think, you are going to be so sick of pizza that if I continue to feed you pizza, you're just going to say, okay, I'm going to eat as little of this pizza as I possibly can until I'm no longer hungry because I just don't like to eat it. It's the same thing with white rice. If you eat white rice and vegetables every single day, 3 meals a day, which is, what they're eating in China, like different types of, vegetables with white rice, pretty soon you're going to be like, I will eat the rice because I'm hungry. As soon as I stop being hungry, I am stopping eating because I know the hedonic effect of food, the pleasure-giving sense of food goes away when it's completely monotonous. So you can eat all that. And, you're not going to overeat it because you don't want to. Yeah. You just want to make sure you're not hungry. And therefore, any monotonous diet always works because you've just very quickly run out of things that you want to eat.
Yeah.
So what we've done, of course, in the modern age is we've introduced all kinds of varieties of food, which keeps us eating beyond the we're full sort of stage. I've got my nutrition. I'm done. I don't want to eat anymore. We never get that state because we're always like, well, we want to keep eating. And then you get around it by snacking because even if there's lots of good things to eat, so you go to a buffet, all you can eat restaurant, after a certain point, you have to stop. Like you can't keep going. It's, if you've eaten everything and somebody says, hey, why don't you have a bit more of this pork chop? You'd be like, oh, that's going to make me throw up, right? It's the same pork chop as you ate like 20 minutes ago, but you're now full. So the point is that if you take away the sort of pleasure-giving part of food, then you're going to be able to control a lot of overweight, obesity, which is what the white rice was, right? It was monotonous. It was just every single day was the same thing. Like I can tell you, I ate rice a lot growing up because My parents were immigrants. They came from Hong Kong. We ate rice probably every single day. So yeah, I liked rice, all right, but until you're full, then that's it. Like,
yeah,
I don't want to eat more than I have to because I've eaten too much of it already. So that's why it's always, people say, oh, therefore carbs are good, or you have the Kempner rice diet from the 40s. Hey, that proves that carbs aren't the enemy. It's like, no. It's very complicated. Like you can't just simplify things into like, this food is good and this food is bad, right? So there's a lot that goes into sort of understanding it. And satiety plays a big role in that. That is why the things that are most successful at controlling weight are hormonal agents that control your appetite. So nicotine is a classic example. It actually suppresses your appetite. People notice this when they stop smoking, that their appetite goes up. And it's probably because it was chronically suppressed. Same thing with semaglutide, some of the drugs that are used now. But anyway, so it means that the carbohydrates are not the only thing that matters. It matters the type of carbohydrate. So is it amylopectin A, amylopectin C, how often you're eating it, because it's not just how high you spike it, and how refined it is going to affect how high it spikes. The foods you eat it with are also going to make a difference. And this is always very interesting to me, because you can take the same foods and that's not what's important. The hormonal response is what's important. If you take the same food at breakfast versus dinner, you're going to have a different insulin response to it. Yeah. So you're going to actually have a much higher insulin response at nighttime versus breakfast. Same thing with something like vinegar. And this is very interesting, actually, I think. So when you take sushi rice, for example, which is vinegared rice, when you take an acid or lemon juice with bread, or vinegar with bread, for example, you can take, say, 100 grams of bread, and you can measure how much your glycemic index goes up. And when you take it with the acid, it's like 50%, 60% of what it was without the acid, which is fascinating because it's the same 100 grams of carbohydrate. So say you take white rice versus vinegared rice, the glucose level and the insulin level goes up to about 65, 69, something like that, versus 100. So you have much less effect. And there's an interesting reason why that is. And it's because in terms of digestion of starch, is digested by a hormone called amylase. There's salivary amylase and there's pancreatic amylase. So the assumption, so you eat bread, the saliva contains amylase, starts breaking down that starch. Because remember, starch is a chain of glucose. You need to break it into little pieces so that you can absorb it. The saliva contains amylase that immediately starts to work it. And we had assumed always that most of the digestion is through the pancreas. It turns out that up to 80%, 60 to 80% of the digestion can be salivary amylase, because salivary amylase is deactivated by low stomach pH. So we assumed you chew it, boom, it goes into the stomach, and all of a sudden salivary amylase stops. It stops breaking down the starch. But in fact, because of the bolus of food, the pH of the stomach actually never gets down there. It doesn't get low enough to deactivate salivary amylase. So if you take something like bread with vinegar, like they do, olive oil and vinegar, for example, turns out that you don't break down the same amount of starch, and therefore your glycemic index goes much lower, your insulin spikes go much lower, and it's because of the acid in the food. Yeah. Lemon juice does that. Fermented food does that, which is lactic acid. Vinegar, which is acetic acid, does that. So there are things that you can take with the carbs that will also affect it. If you take carbs first versus last in the meal, you take it with protein or with fat, it's going to make a difference. So there's so many things that make a difference other than just cutting the total number.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that officially qualifies as a hack. The term hack is, thrown around a lot these days, but that seems like a really practical thing that people can do within the context of their own diet, just to lower that glucose and lower that insulin response in the body. If you enjoyed that clip from my podcast, here's another powerful clip that is really going to help you with your health and happiness.
In the short term, it can lead to allergy and autoimmunity, but long term, it looks as if it increases the risk of a whole diverse range of very serious chronic diseases.